lot of companies are issuing tokens in the space. It's a good thing to be familiar with kind of who's doing it right, who's doing it wrong, what kind of is out there that is noise versus what is legit. So hopefully this will give you a better sense of that. So we've covered decentralization. Now we're gonna go right into tokens. So 4 things we're gonna cover: myth busting and fundamentals. We're gonna cover the basics of launching a token. I'm gonna give you some hard and fast rules for token launches, and then we'll talk about some additional considerations. All right, myth busting and fundamentals. So there's a lot of noise about tokens, right? The SEC, the chair of the SEC, basically says that all tokens are securities and that the rules are clear. But if the rules were clear, right, why are there thousands of outstanding circulating tokens, right? And the SEC has only successfully brought a handful of successful enforcement actions, right? Fundamentally, that doesn't make sense. What he is saying cannot possibly be true unless they're just deliberately not enforcing the law. So in reality, the rules are anything, or not all tokens are securities, and the rules are anything but clear. And he's in front of the House Financial Service Committee today, answering to a lot of congressional members about kind of the way that he's approached the industry. So it's a challenging kind of environment, right? Many tokens actually probably should be subject to securities laws. In a lot of instances, right, people are dependent on a management team to drive the value of those tokens. And as a result of that, you do see a lot of instances where people are harmed from investing in tokens. In 2017, which is when I started getting involved in this industry, ICOs were all of the rage, and people were kind of conducting fundraisings, selling tokens with promises that their company was going to do X, Y, and Z. And those are situations where securities laws probably should apply, even though you don't have all the contractual protections of equity. Right, at the end of the day, people were buying these tokens with the expectation that the management team was going to deliver something. But that's very different from what the world looks like today. Right, people don't really sell tokens to U.S. persons anymore, and most often you see tokenization happen at a step where people are really trying to decentralize, and they're using tokens as a vehicle to do so. So it's inherently necessary to have tokens if we're going to have decentralized systems. Right, Ethereum would not work without ETH. Bitcoin wouldn't work without Bitcoin. But drawing the line is very difficult. Right, the SEC has said, that even the chair has said, that Bitcoin is not a security. And then he's said that other tokens are. And when pressed on trying to find out what the line is between what is a security and what's not a security, he says, well, there's no people in the middle, which obviously is not a very defined test. But ultimately, right, there is a line there. And the SEC last provided guidance on where that line was in 2019. And obviously the industry has changed a significant amount since that time. But our job here is to try and help our founders kind of figure out where the line is and to take steps to kind of get across it. Now, a lot of questions, one question that a lot of people that are not familiar with the space often ask is, well, why don't, the SEC, the chair of the SEC obviously says, come in and register. And so why don't kind of projects go in and register? Well, the reason is that the way that securities laws work, right, is that if a token was registered as a security, you couldn't transact in that token on chain. Right, and so if for an instance, for a protocol like Filecoin, where you use Filecoin to actually buy storage, right, it would be impossible. You can't actually do that under securities laws. And so as a result of that, registration, even though the chair of the SEC likes to offer it up, it's actually a death sentence for any project. Right, so it's not an option, and fundamentally it's unnecessary. As I was saying in the last presentation, right, decentralization obviates the risks associated with some digital assets. And as a result of that, if you don't have the risks associated with managerial efforts, information asymmetries, then you shouldn't need to apply a legal regime that addresses risks that aren't present. Right? That is just applying regulation for regulation's sake, which is generally something that shouldn't be done. So all of this is very frustrating. Right, and I think that generally speaking, this is the biggest kind of frustration that people have in the space is dealing with the laws that apply to tokens. It's very unclear. It's very difficult to kind of navigate, and it's hard to know kind of what you can do and what you can't do. And so that's kind of what we're here to help with. Now, I'll start with kind of just the general premise, and I mentioned this in the last presentation. Right, tokens are not equity. and they should not be thought of as equity. They should not be thought of as a proxy for equity or an analogy for equity, right? Fundamentally, tokens are very, very different from equity. They do not have any contractual or statutory rights, right? If you are a stockholder of a company, then the board of directors and the officers of that company are legally bound, right, to maximize shareholder value. You do not have that right as a token holder. You literally just own a token, right? So as a result of that, it's very different. Your relationship with the team that issued that token, your relationship with kind of the underlying technology is very different from equity. Protocols are not companies, right? Protocols are autonomous software that functions on-chain, and generally, if there is any revenue that accrues to a token, it should come to the functioning of that protocol, right? A protocol is very different from a company. A company operates in the real world, has officers, has directors, has all of these things that are operating to kind of make sure that it functions and generates revenue. That is very different from a protocol. Voting rights are also very limited, right? In a company, the voting rights that are associated with the share of stock allow you to choose the board of directors, and the board of directors then kind of chooses who are the officers of the company, kind of driving force for the overall economic value that accrues to a share. That is not the case with tokens. In a lot of cases, people practice governance minimization, which means that you only have votes with respect to a small number of parameters. There are grant programs and other things associated with the treasury, but fundamentally, right, the voting rights that you get as a token holder are very different. So, again, cannot stress this enough. Your frame of reference, the place where you start from, should not be that tokens are equity. And that's a hard concept because there's a lot of noise around this, right? The Twitter influencers constantly kind of like basically categorize tokens as though they're equity, talk about them like they're equity, and really frame them as though they're equity and value them as though they're equity. And that is a fundamental problem because ultimately, and it really limits the design space for what tokens make possible. So as a result of that, I really want you all to be encouraged to kind of go away from that model in your mind. Now, one of the things that tokens enable that I think is very exciting, right, and we talked about this in the last presentation, is this idea of kind of stakeholder capitalism. The ability to basically accrue benefits to actors within an ecosystem on a more equitable basis than what happens in equity. Right? With equity and with shares, right? A company is mandated by law to basically maximize shareholder value, right? As a result of that, everything that they do, all of the benefits of the things that they do accrue to the shareholders, right? Now, within the equity world, there's this idea of stakeholder capitalism has come up, and this notion of directly accruing all benefit, all value to stockholders, right, has kind of morphed a little bit into allow companies to have other goals, right? And these are most often called public benefit corporations. And so what those corporations can do is they can basically say, hey, in addition to maximizing shareholder value, what we're going to do is we have this other goal, and we're going to try and achieve that as well. This most often comes up in the context of ESG initiatives, right? So a company will say, well, we want to be carbon neutral, and we're going to let that goal kind of offset the goal of maximizing shareholder value. Now, generally speaking, I would say that stakeholder capitalism within the equity world has failed by and large, right? It doesn't really kind of work as well as it should, and the result of that is one of the big complications there, right? Is that it's fundamentally very difficult to overcome the legacy debt of always kind of maximizing things for shareholders. Now, tokens offer us a new way forward, right? Tokens do not have kind of all of the restrictions that shares have, and as a result of that, the design space is much broader, right? You can actually use tokens to accrue value to people that are participating in your ecosystem, right? You can use it to incentivize different activities that are going to be beneficial for the ecosystem, and you can empower individuals much more significantly than you can within a share-based regime. These concepts, right, of stakeholder capitalism can basically be applied to a lot of different, types of models. So, for instance, safety modules are a concept where basically you create an insurance pool that, then pays out to the extent that there is any harm suffered by users of the protocol. So basically, you're creating an insurance fund. And you can reward people for staking their governance tokens into a safety module that they then use to underwrite the kind of insurance risk of the protocol. And as a result, you pay stakeholders or token holders for staking those assets. So again, it's a benefit that the protocol gets, and it's a benefit that it then distributes to people by rewarding them for having contributed. Other things that we can see, right? You can incentivize voting. You reward people for actually participating in governance. You can reward them for Content creation. Token curated registries was an idea that came around pretty early in the life cycle of blockchain, but it's starting to come back around now. So for instance, let's say that you had a platform where there was a lot of content being generated, actually rewarding for people for curating that content for others to then visit or use, right, is a way that you can then reward people for contributing to the ecosystem. All of this can be done with governance tokens and drive an economic model to those governance tokens without falling trap to the equity type distributions that we see in the shareholder world, so dividends and token repurchase. Okay, so we'll go through the basics of launching a token. 3 things to focus on: decentralization, incentivization, and security. Now, again, on crypto Twitter, you'll see a lot of people like break down token launches and try to explain what teams did wrong. There's a lot of people that have a lot of different opinions about what token launches should look like. For the most part, all of those people are playing in the casino and not people that are playing in the tech and they're focused on the tech. Ultimately, when you launch a token, what you're not trying to do, like referring to it as an IPO, like it's crazy and it's not where you should be focused. Ultimately, those are your goals that should be in place when you launch a token. You should not be focused on kind of creating an investable opportunity for the general public, right? That's not what you care about, and it's not what matters at all. What matters is these 3 things. So let's look at them. As we talked about in the last presentation, tokens enable you to decentralize your ecosystem, right? They enable you to turn on decentralized governance, and they allow you to basically turn a closed network into an open network. They make it so that you can turn your protocol into something that is credibly neutral. As a result of that, it can then be built on top of by other people. So it's a fundamental component of decentralization. It also allows you to build out incentivization, right? If you want other people to build on top of your ecosystem, if you want to turn your closed network to an open network, you have to fundamentally use tokens to do that. And then it allows you to build in security, right? Fundamentally, the token price is going to be relevant for whether or not the system is secure. And that is a key component of the overall decentralization. So, when are you ready to launch a token? The simple answer is the Bahamas test. This test basically asks, okay, well, if the management team was to disappear tomorrow, what would happen? And if the answer is nothing would happen, then you pass the Bahamas test. So the idea here is fundamentally, right, that the management team is not driving the value of the token. So if a management team disappeared, it shouldn't be relevant to the price of the token. Now, this test is obviously pretty simplistic. And the answer is that it's actually a lot more complicated. As I've said, right, you want to have product market fit before you launch a token. It's critical to do this because fundamentally, post launching a token, anything that you do to work on the protocol, right, could be misconstrued by the SEC as evidence of centralization, right? And so anything, if as we talked about in the last presentation, if token holders are dependent on the management company or the management team, right, to drive value, to make sure that the more features are being added, right, then fundamentally you're kind of impeding the decentralization of the system. So you want to make sure that you have product market fit before you launch your token. You want a sustainable token model, right? This is something that a lot of protocols ignore, is that fundamentally, right, tokens are not magic beans, right? They have unit economics applied to them. And as a result of that, if a protocol is spending far more than it is earning in terms of revenue over time, that protocol will go into insolvency, right? There is no kind of way to escape the fact that unit economics do ultimately apply to tokens. And then you want to look at your decentralization progress, right? This really speaks to the Bahamas test portion of it, where like ultimately, are you going to be decentralized? Are you pursuing progressive decentralization? How are you fundamentally positioning your protocol with respect to its overall decentralization? And really what you want to be, you want to be as decentralized as possible when you are kind of ready to issue your token. Okay, so there are several drawbacks to issuing a token. First of all, they're a massive distraction, all right? The second that you launch a token, everyone becomes focused on token price, including the market and including your own employees, right? So all of a sudden, it doesn't even matter if your team is doing very well, right? And you're doing everything that you want to be doing. If for some reason the market goes down and the token price is underwater, right? People are not going to be happy. So all of a sudden, by launching a token, you introduce this layer of complexity with respect to motivation and kind of running your own business that otherwise, you wouldn't have to deal with. Decentralization is hard, right? While it has many benefits, it is slow, it's inefficient, and it can make it extremely difficult for companies to operate, right? As I said earlier, any type of activity that you undertake is going to be pointed to by the SEC as evidence that you're centralized, right? And that people are reliant on your efforts. And so as a result of that, right, you have to be very careful about the activity that you engage in. You fundamentally want to be decentralized, and that is very hard, right? And then finally, token launches are inherently risky, right? You're adding a lot of layers of complexity to your ecosystem, and potentially, right, that could be regulatory risk, right? If you've launched a token and you are not decentralized, then it is very possible that the SEC will come after you. And obviously that's very hard because at the end of the day, the SEC has not clearly identified what layer or what level of decentralization you need to achieve in order for you not to have regulatory risk. But again, that's kind of the thing that we're here to help with. So here are some hard and fast rules for token launches. First, we'll start with 3 truths. Regulatory uncertainty in the US helps bad actors, okay? This is something that a lot of regulators and a lot of policymakers don't understand. But at the end of the day, the only thing that regulatory uncertainty does is it helps people that want to be bad actors and it hurts people that want to be good actors, right? What do I mean by that? So if there's no certainty around who can issue a token and who can't issue a token, right, but we do have some general guidance around what it should be, well then a lot of companies will, in good faith, try to meet that criteria and try to operate within the bounds of it, right? And so if a company isn't necessarily decentralized, right, they'll wait to build to issue their token, and they'll continue to try and work on the decentralization component, which, as I said, is very hard. It's inefficient and it's slow, and it ultimately can it makes it more difficult to obtain. But bad actors don't care about any of that, right? And as a result of that, if you want to make a quick profit by selling a token and launching a product, and you want to get the commercial benefits that come with issuing a token, which is that you get more users, right? Then ultimately you're going to cut corners to basically launch your token. Decentralization as a concept is very, very difficult to tell from the outside whether or not something is actually decentralized. And as a result of that, if you want to go quickly to market and be a bad actor, you just obfuscate whether or not you're decentralized. You play the game of decentralization theater. And so what the lack of regulatory clarity in the United States has really done, right, is it has meant that people that are actually trying to decentralize and build decentralized systems, right, are at a significant disadvantage compared to people that are just trying to pretend that they are decentralized. And as a result of that, you have a significant imbalance of the competitive playing field, right? Another hard piece of this is that government inaction is not consent. This is one of the hardest conversations that I have with founders, is that fundamentally, right, if you go out and you see your competitor doing X, Y, Z, right, and the government not kind of doing anything about it, that does not mean that you can go do X, Y, Z. And that is fundamentally very difficult, right, because assuredly what X, Y, and Z is going to be something that is helping that protocol versus your protocol. And so you're going to be at a competitive disadvantage because you're not willing to engage in the regulatory arbitrage that your competitors are engaged in. But fundamentally, right, despite all of that, it is critical, right, that you do not then engage in those types of games. Building decentralized systems that are going to stand the test of time is incredibly difficult and something that has to be undertaken with a lot of deliberate thought and effort, right? And cutting corners to get to a token launch is not the way that we want our companies to be working, and it's not the way that you should be wanting to build your company. Fundamentally, all of the companies that kind of rush out and launch tokens are ones that are most likely to fail. So the biggest mistake that companies make in this space is to launch tokens too early, right? It's incredibly difficult to watch your competitors go out there and take advantage of launching tokens, right? But at the end of the day, you shouldn't do it until you are actually decentralized and you have a credible plan of further decentralization. So I said I would give you some rules, and here they are. Number 1, do not sell tokens to US persons, okay? I think, and we'll get into that more. Do not hype up your token as an investment opportunity, right? Be very wary about secondary listings. Decentralization matters, and communications matter. Okay, number one, right, is the sales of tokens to US persons, right? In 2017 and 2018, people were selling tons of tokens to US persons, and they were all calling these fundraisings. And so as a result of that, right, it became very clear that people were buying tokens with the expectation that people were then going to develop a product. And despite the fact that there wasn't kind of contractual kind of promises of that they were going to develop X, Y, Z, people disclaimed that they were going to do whatever they wanted with the money. Fundamentally, you have to look at the economic reality of those transactions. People were expecting, right, the founders of these companies to build stuff with the money that they were giving them. And so as a result of that, the SEC came down pretty hard on it. Now the system has evolved, or the ecosystem has evolved quite a bit since 2017 and 2018. No one really sells tokens to US persons anymore. For the most part, they airdrop them to US persons, and people are rewarded for participating in those ecosystems. And any tokens that are sold, right, are typically sold in private placement transactions relating to kind of equity and token sales. And so the problem that was kind of addressed in 2017 and 18 has really been solved. But fundamentally, right, there's still a lot of pressures for people to kind of, engage in sales in the United States. And as a result, right, you do see that still happen every once in a while. There is just no fact pattern that is more likely to get you in front of the SEC than selling tokens to US persons. It is the thing that looks most like a securities transaction and is therefore the thing that they kind of clamp down on the hardest. So that is the first rule. The second rule is not to hype your tokens as an investment opportunity, right? So this is a challenging kind of subject, right? If you are a founder and you've launched a token, then you're going to be out there and people are going to be talking about your token pretty regularly. But you want to be extremely careful about what you say about your token, because anything that you say, right, is going to be misconstrued as you trying to get people to invest in your token. Now, let me give you an example of this, right? Having in your white paper, right, that your token will go up in value over time as people use the protocol has been used by the SEC as evidence, right, that they were marketing, that the company was marketing the token as an investable asset. And as a result of that, that the people relying on their efforts and that the token should therefore be treated like securities. So you want to be very, very careful, right, around the idea of like what does this asset represent, right? How are you talking about it? Fundamentally, if it was up to me, our founders would never talk about their tokens whatsoever, because anything is so easy to misconstrue. You take it out of context, you frame it in the light of like, this is what they were trying to do, they had bad intentions, right? And it's just very easy to misconstrue. So as a result of that, it's very dangerous. Third issue is secondary markets, right? Now, as we said, one of the key things about a token launch is that you're increasing the security of the system, right? And the security that comes with launching a token, right, directly relates to the price of that token. If a token price declined in value to fractions of a cent, then someone might be able to buy enough of it that they would be able to launch a governance attack. So let's say that happened, you launch your token, the price is very volatile, short sellers piling on, the price goes down, someone comes in and buys up a substantial portion sufficient to put a proposal in front of governance to liquidate the treasury to give it to themselves. Obviously, that is a fundamental problem with kind of how you've launched your token. And so as a result of that, secondary listings are a way to combat that, because they basically mean that you can have more tokens out there, and as a result, like, you can basically help to clamp down on volatility. But fundamentally, the SEC has kind of said any talking about secondary listings is something that they're going to target, because fundamentally the way that they view the world, right, is that if you're talking about secondary listings, what you're really trying to do is encourage people to invest in that asset. So as a result of that, right, you want to be very careful in the way that you talk about secondary listings. Also, secondary listings, right, if we've seen over time, right, listings have typically led to increases in token prices. And so if you're out there as a founder saying, oh, we're going to get listed on X, Y, and Z platforms, right, then the idea that you're planning in people's heads is that you're going to do some work that's going to lead to an increase in the token price. And fundamentally, that's kind of the managerial efforts point they were talking about in the last presentation. So you want to avoid that type of activity. The fourth one is decentralization matters. So if we go back to the ICO phase in 2017 or 18, and we still see this somewhat now, there are really two arguments that people were making as to why tokens shouldn't be deemed to be securities. The first was what's called the utility token argument, right? And this is the idea that essentially people are acquiring these tokens not because they have an expectation of profits based on managerial efforts, but because they intend to use them, right? And so the idea, like if you think about Filecoin or something like that, where you're going to actually take this asset, consume it, or even ETH, right? You're going to use it in transactions that are occurring on the Ethereum blockchain. The SEC in 2017 and 18, right, and subsequently has been like, no, that argument's pretty much bullshit. We don't agree. If you have a speculative asset that is out there, even if you can use it, that is not going to be sufficient to kind of overcome the securities analysis. And the most recent case that came out on this was really that agreed with the SEC was the Library case. So Library was a protocol that was kind of very similar to Filecoin in the sense it had like decentralized storage, and ultimately you could buy Library coins and you could use them as part of the services that the protocol was offering. And they did a token sale back in 2017 or 18, I think, and the judge recently ruled in that case that the SEC had brought against them was that, you know, fundamentally it did not matter that you could use those tokens in the protocol. It was still going to be a security. So what that leaves us with is one argument as to why tokens shouldn't be treated as securities, and that argument is that the asset is decentralized, right? And so that's kind of what we went through in the last presentation, where we talk about the technical decentralization, economic decentralization, and legal decentralization. The legal test is really looking at, right, whether or not you can eliminate the risk of significant significant information asymmetries arising, and whether or not you can eliminate the reliance on managerial efforts of others. Right? So if you can take out those two components, and that's really like the decentralization piece that we're focused on with respect to tokens, if you can assure that both of those things are correct or true, then your token shouldn't be treated like a security. Again, eliminating those two things eliminates the risk that securities laws are meant to curtail, right? And so if you can eliminate the risk that securities laws are meant to address, then you eliminate the need to apply securities laws. The final piece is that communications really matter. Talked about this a little bit in the hype context, but you can see a bunch of examples here of, you know, founders basically talking about their project and setting expectations for the general public. So when you talk about a roadmap and you talk about things that you're developing, if you refer to your team as the core development team, as you refer to the protocol as your protocol, all of these things, right, that would be very natural for how you would deal with a centralized actor, right? A CEO of a company that's talking about their company is going to talk about it as their company, right? But when you are a decentralized ecosystem, there's a fundamental difference, right? You are no longer in control. You are no longer responsible. You are no longer the one that is kind of dictating everything that's going to happen, and you don't want to be setting expectations of value that you're going to drive to the protocol. Fundamentally, what you need to be doing, right, is you are a single actor in this ecosystem, and you are not responsible for anything. Right? And so communications on that front really matters. The lowest hanging fruit in this regard are two things, right? Naming your company the same as your protocol is inherently problematic, right? Because what are people going to expect? They're going to expect that the company that's named after the protocol, that's named after the token, is going to drive value for that thing. And so as a result of that, a very simple low-hanging fruit that you can do is just to change the name of your company as compared to the protocol and the underlying digital asset. The other thing is ensuring that when you do engage in a token launch, right, that you set up your protocol with separate communication channels from the company itself, right? And so as a result of that, what the protocol is tweeting about is very different, and how it's tweeting about stuff is very different from what the development team that started the protocol is. Again, what you're trying to do is you're trying to prevent people that are operating or playing within that ecosystem from developing an expectation that they're reliant on you for the token price to change in value and you know, increase in value. Okay, so we'll now talk about some additional considerations. So, token allocations. This is I would say, a pretty important topic. It's one that there are a lot of you know, consulting firms out there that will basically do a token plan for you, where they'll put together, you know, a chart like this, and they'll charge you like 1% of your tokens for this. And like, I'm pretty sure you can get ChatGPT to do most of this work for you. But if we break this down into groups, right, we can say, okay, well, we have an airdrop, We have an amount that goes to insiders, so that's employees and investors. And then you have an amount that goes to the community, right? Generally speaking, like I put some, ranges that these fall within, but fundamentally, right, I think that the thing that you'll like deal with most up front, right, is the allocation to your, to employees and to your investors. Typically, you'll set it up where people get tokens based on their respective equity ownership within the company, and so you'll use equity ownership as a proxy for that. And typically, it's then just a matter of figuring out, okay, well, how much are you going to actually distribute to the cap table? Now, historically, that level of what you've given to the cap table has been kind of around between 40 and 50%. I do think that that's going to change over time, particularly with respect to the decentralization models that I talked about earlier, where you're going to need to start incentivizing more third parties to develop within ecosystems. And as a result of that, you can imagine that you're going to need more tokens reserved for kind of those players. Airdrops are a pretty common mechanism that people use. I'll talk about those a little bit more in a minute. Generally, you see those range from about 5 to 20%. And then you see 40 to 60% being set aside for the community, for treasury, for future incentivization. And then another component of this is that when you have a layer one blockchain that is let's say producing block rewards that are going to miners or validators, you'll often have a inflation schedule where the overall token supply kind of increases at time. So these this breakdown would really be what it is at the outset, not kind of what it is in 10 years after the protocol's been running. Okay, so a few issues that come up with respect to token launches. The first one is the token liquidity dilemma, right? I talked about this a little earlier in the context of secondary listings, but one of the fundamental problems that people have when they launch a token, right, is ensuring that there's sufficient liquidity to not cause a lot of volatility. The reason you want there not to be volatility is that you fundamentally, you don't want people that are buying the token for some reason, not at your encouragement. You don't want them to be hurt, right? You don't want them to lose their money. And then at the same time, you also don't want people to be able to manipulate the market price of the token, particularly to drive it down and then make it easy for someone to acquire a bunch and potentially then attack governance. Same thing on the upside, right? You don't want the token price to skyrocket in value because then it's going to be more likely that people get hurt. So there's this fundamental problem where, okay, well, how do you actually get enough liquidity out there when U.S. securities laws make it fundamentally challenging to get tokens into the hands of U.S. persons? Now, one of the ways that people do this, and if you've been paying attention to Arbitrum's recent launching of their token, right? One of the ways that people deal with this liquidity challenge is they use market makers. Now, crypto Twitter and the influencers on there, right, see this as quite scandalous because at the end of the day, they kind of looked and saw that Arbitrum was using a market maker, and they thought, well, look, Arbitrum's actually just dumping tokens on retail because they're using this market maker to go out and sell, and they've sold these tokens to market makers. What the influencers don't really understand is that that's not actually what's happening, right? Fundamentally, the use of market makers around token launches is designed to prevent there from being volatility. You're not actually trying to make money, or the company is not actually trying to make money through the use of these relationships. What they're trying to do is overall dampen the potential volatility that comes with a low amount of liquidity. And so what you're trying to do, right, is basically smooth around the edges and reduce overall risk to the ecosystem. And so, what a lot of the people that were criticizing Arbitrum for was like, well, we want the exact details of that market-making relationship. But if you were to disclose the exact details of the market-making relationship, the market-making wouldn't work. And as a result of that, the relationship and the whole point of it would be useless. So as a result of that, there's a lot of consternation, there's a lot of noise on Twitter about, what you should have done and how these things should be structured. Ultimately, you should just ignore that, right? Focus on the tech, not the casino. All of those Twitter influencers are just playing in the casino, and that's the game that they're playing, and ultimately it's not something that you should be concerned about. All right, airdrops. Airdrops have a lot of benefits, right? They help you decentralize the protocol by distributing the token far and wide, right? They reward ecosystem participants because you basically, you're incentivizing the people that participated early, right? You can establish a baseline for decentralized governance, right? Decentralized governance doesn't work if you don't have decentralized token holders. So as a result of that, you can basically kind of foster an ecosystem where decentralized governance is even possible. And then you can incentivize ongoing good behavior. One of the things that we saw with Optimism's token airdrop, right, is that they indicated that they were going to do a second one. And as a result of that, people were all of a sudden speculating what type of like good activity on the part of individuals was going to, lead to them qualifying for the second airdrop. And so as a result of that, I think, their kind of token launch has been a bit stickier, and you've seen people kind of that and the total value locked on Optimism, kind of continue to grow rather than, people kind of farming the airdrop and then leaving. Now there are a lot of costs. As I said earlier, right, any token model has to have, unit economics do apply to it. And as a result of that, right, there is real capital cost to issuing your governance token to, individuals. And so this isn't kind of an unending supply. You're also diluting your own self and your investors. And so you do want to kind of right size it. They're also subject to Sybil attacks. Right, so that means that people basically creating thousands of wallets to then kind of engage with the protocol to then make them eligible to receive an airdrop. There are securities laws risks, right? While the SEC would like to misconstrue, right, that what an airdrop is doing is you're basically creating a liquid market for you to then sell your token into. But that isn't what actually happens, right? 9 times out of 10, or in all of the token launches that we work on, right, the founding team and all the employees, all the investors are locked up for a period of years post-token launch. So there's no liquid market for them to be selling into. Really, the sole goal, again, as I said earlier, right, is decentralization, incentivization, and security. It's not to kind of create a liquid market for you to sell into. Nevertheless, right, the SEC will construe things the way that they want to construe them, and as a result of that, there are securities laws risks associated with airdrops. And then as a result of any token launch, right, you're going to end up with potential secondary market activity where, no matter what you do, for instance, if you launch an ERC20 coin, someone can go and list it on Uniswap the next day. And as a result of that, you can end up with a market that you didn't intend to create. And so as a result of that, right, that just kind of increases the overall risk. It's not just risk from the SEC, right? There's risk that someone's going to go out, speculate in your token, and then sue you because the token price didn't go up. And we've been seeing a lot more of kind of the class action lawsuits being brought by token holders that feel aggrieved over their kind of gambling. All right, so then some risk mitigation strategies, right? So I think there's a lot of different ways, and I talked about this in the context of progressive decentralization, right? There are ways that you can help to mitigate the risks associated with kind of launching a token and give yourself a little bit more time to kind of decentralize. The first option is not an option that I like, but it is an option, right, is just excluding the United States, right? At the end of the day, the U.S. has created an environment where there is a significant lack of clarity, and the SEC has clearly identified it as someone that is an enemy of innovation and is trying to kind of target token issuers. And as a result of that, the simple answer is to just say, well, screw it, we're not going to go to the U.S. Now, this option doesn't really work, right? If your market is in the United States and you fundamentally need U.S. persons that are customers and people that are interacting with your protocol. But, right, what it does allow you to do is it essentially allows you to kind of get some of the benefits of having a token, right, help you decentralize more while limiting the amount of risk that you're taking in the U.S. because of securities laws. So for instance, if you at the outset launched a token outside the United States, only airdropped it to non-U.S. persons, used market makers on secondary, on exchanges outside the United States to try and deal with volatility, then what you'd be able to do is get your token to be distributed quite broadly, right? And you would be able to do that without taking on necessarily securities law risk. There are things that you have to do to kind of ensure that you don't kind of become a target of an SEC investigation as a result of those types of issuance. So, for instance, you don't want to be marketing on Twitter that you've launched this token. I think that one protocol, right, had anyone claiming an airdrop. They excluded U.S. persons, but then they had anyone that was claiming an airdrop basically post on Twitter about claiming the airdrop. And as a result of that, it's like pretty obvious what they're trying to do, right? They're basically kind of drum up U.S. interest in their token. And as a result of that, right, that stuff is inherently risky. But so if you're going to be outside the U.S., right, that is a thing that you can do to stage your overall kind of token issuance strategy. Another option that we've been pursuing a lot with a lot of our protocols and that we like is transfer restricted tokens. So what transfer restricted tokens basically means, right, is that you would limit the ability of people to A, transact in them, to sell them to one another, right, or to just send them to other wallets, right? But then you would also kind of limit the ability to interact with smart contracts other than smart contracts that are in your ecosystem. So that what that would limit people from being able to do, right, is create secondary markets that they can then speculate in those assets. So, you know, no one would be able to go list this token on Uniswap, for example, despite, you know, while you had these restrictions in place. Now, the inherent problem with this, right, is that fundamentally, in order, as we've talked about, in order for a network to be open and not closed, tokens need to be fully transferable. Right? And so eventually, right, the transferability of these tokens needs to be turned on. Otherwise, right, the network effects that you've created accrue to whoever is controlling that decision and controlling the network as opposed to token holders. But, right, because you limit the ability for secondary markets to be created and can limit the overall speculation that would take place as a result, right, you do decrease the amount of securities laws risk that you're taking on by issuing tokens in this fashion. In addition, right, you get the benefit of being able to use tokens as an incentivization mechanism by issuing them to people and rewarding them for the activity that you want to incentivize. And so as a result of that, right, we think that this is kind of a good happy medium. You know, it allows you to kind of include US persons, and it allows you to kind of get a lot of the benefits of the tokens, but it has reduced risk. That risk isn't zero, right? There is a chance that the SEC will target this type of activity, but fundamentally we think that a lot of the potential harm is reduced, and that there are, you know, there are any number of pathways that people take that are much more kind of objectionable from the SEC's perspective. So we think that this is a pretty good option. And I think that's it.
Thanks. I have two questions. One is, like, when you say, like, to launch your token outside the US,
yeah.
Like, what type of information are we expected to collect just to determine that the recipients wouldn't be in the US, for example?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of different ways to do it, right? I think that you know, there are, and again, I think it really depends on the totality of your circumstances and how you want to kind of, you know, assess the risk, right? But let's just say like, you always got to be, the willingness to kind of use these risk mitigation strategies really like depends on kind of how much risk you have on the decentralization side. If you're really decentralized, right, then you probably don't need to be like, but you still want to take some of the risk out of the table, then you probably don't need to be as stringent as you would, right, as compared if you were not decentralized at all, but still wanted to issue a token, right? In that scenario, you would want to be very strict about how you are restricting people from getting the token. So for instance, like any like IP address that's ever logged using your application, right, you would want to exclude from, you know, you would associate it with an address and then exclude it from the list, right? And then you could also block the, you know, the website that people use to claim their tokens. You could also put, you know, IP blockers in place to restrict people from the United States. Now, if you wanted to go a layer deeper than that, right, you could also start to block VPNs and say, okay, well, we know that there's a list of like known VPN IP addresses, and we're going to block those as well. So like, it basically just depends on how stringent you want to be based on how much risk that you otherwise are taking on with respect to the decentralization. If you're really decentralized, like, I would ultimately say that it's not necessary to exclude the US at all, right? But if you aren't, if it's, you know, you're worried about this progressive decentralization and the chicken and egg problem of tokens and decentralization, then, you know, you might want to engage in some limited risk mitigation on the token issuance.
Awesome. And then my last question is, since there's no clear regulation, like, how assertive should like the law firm that we're working with be? Like, what is the type of feedback that we need to get from them? And
yeah, what I would say is that law firms are generally like good about, okay, we have a defined pathway, we know how to walk it, like we know how to guide companies down it. And what they're not good about doing is they're not good about like coming up with creative solutions of, okay, well, the unique facts and circumstances of your case mean that you should do this. They also tend to be like fairly risk averse, right? Because ultimately, like, they don't want to be the ones that you come back to and say, well, what, I thought you said this was okay. So you're very unlikely to get an opinion from a law firm, right, that's going to say this is fine, right? What you want is you want a good partner that's basically helping you kind of view the totality of the circumstances and saying, okay, well, you can take on some risk here, right? You're de-risked here, and really kind of look at it from a wholesale view. And that's one of the things that we help our companies with, right? We obviously see a lot of companies go through this process, and one of the things that we then try and encourage everyone is to basically stay, with the herd, right? And basically do what others are doing where we think it's generally safe, and not go, very far afield and engage in activities that are gonna, make you an outlier.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hey, Miles. So follow up on my previous question. So by selling tokens to a U.S. person, does that count in NFT, and also does that count in secondary sales?
So NFTs are a good kind of example of like how it's more challenging how the laws apply, right? So generally speaking, right, an NFT sale is different from a fungible token sale, because what you say when you sell someone an NFT, right, is that there's implicit value in that NFT, right? It's the art, like most likely the artwork that's associated with that NFT. It's very different from a fungible token, right, where the implicit value is not just the fungible token. The implicit value is either, okay, maybe you need to use it for something, or, right, you're just speculating it and hoping that it'll profit. The problem that creates within the ecosystem, right, is that like with NFTs, right, you can start to venture into securities law world, right, if you're issuing those NFTs with a lot of promises. So I think like one of the most ridiculous examples was Pixelmon, right, where they sold a bunch of NFTs that were all masked, right, and you didn't know what they were, and they made all of these promises. We're going to build the a Pokemon type video game and you're going to be able to use these NFTs and it's going to be awesome. It's going to be like, and they showed all of these ridiculous images and everything like that. And then, so everyone bought and like, I think they sold over like $60 million worth of NFTs. People piled into this game and these NFTs, and then the developer was supposed to develop, the game, and then they like actually unmasked the NFTs, and it was like all just absolute shit. But so clearly what happened there, right, is that people had an expectation and were trusting the people that sold those NFTs to develop a product around those NFTs. So in that case, I would say there wasn't implicit value with those NFTs, and that looked much more like a securities transaction. And so as a result, we would never recommend our companies to kind of engage in sales of NFTs that looked like that looked as like a fundraising. But it is a much more difficult question than with fungible tokens, because NFTs do have this implicit value that makes them less likely to be securities, unless you do all of these other things that make them look like securities.
Yep, that's very helpful. And then another question I have is, say like the foundation, so the protocol value, like, because we are talking about like how the protocol can distribute value to application, also the foundation, so that the foundation can keep operating, right? So say like the protocol distribute value to foundation, and then the foundation has a voting structure that's based on NFT. So like the money that goes into the foundation, so the foundation almost technically work as a company, and then the revenue from the company is from the protocol. So how do you think of that?
So we'll talk about it more tomorrow during the corporate structuring stuff, right? But generally speaking, foundations are not a like magical tool that you can use to like basically recreate a centralized corporate structure, but just everything is then routed through the foundation. And so, I think that there's a bunch of different approaches, and we'll kind of walk through them tomorrow. But like fundamentally, the foundation shouldn't have a board that is appointed by token holders that then makes decisions about kind of future development efforts. We should really be thinking about foundations more as like people that are supporting the ecosystem, not a centralized force that is like running the entire thing. And so like that dichotomy is an important one, but it also means that I don't think that like the foundation shouldn't be making decisions around like distributions to token holders and stuff like that. You should really kind of be having all of that programmed into the like architecture of the smart contract protocol, so that all of that is happening autonomously and then is voted on directly by token holders.
Yeah, so we're thinking, I don't know if you're familiar with non-style. So essentially the protocol, the foundation just manage the pool of money that's a portion of the protocol revenue.
Yeah.
And then, so I'm just wondering if, and then that's, of course, is not governing the protocol of any form, but it's just, they have the governance of the foundation has
Yeah.
full control of how to use those money. So I don't know if that's, or how to distribute those.
So what I would say in that case, right, is that like ideally you would have a foundation that has less power within an ecosystem, right? Because if a foundation is controlling all of the monetary value generated by
No, like of 10%.
Oh, 10%. So yeah, in that case, like, I think that that's generally fine, right? Like, fundamentally, what they do with that money is not going to be the, like, driving force to or economic value. Now, NounsDAO doesn't have a token, right?
Yeah.
And so if they did, right, then, and let's say, if they did, and let's say 90% of the revenue that came in, or 80%, right, went straight to the token, right, that would be very different, and it would mean that what the foundation is doing is not actually kind of material to the overall, like, token price.
Yeah. And then my last question is actually, so like say we have a token that's like ERC20, but it's not transferable.
Yeah.
That's very different from a ERC20 that's transferable, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So essentially what we're doing is like we periodically distribute cash, like revenue from the protocol to the ERC20 holders, but they didn't buy the ERC20. They earn it through building
Yeah.
games. So I'm not sure, I'm kind of.
Yeah, so I mean, the thing that I would say, right, is that it kind of goes to the point at the outset, right, around like designing systems with stakeholder capitalism rather than with kind of equity type mechanisms. So I think the thing that we want to prioritize and that we want our companies to be building is, rather than a distribution model where protocol revenue just gets dividended out to token holders, right, is that protocol revenue is then used to incentivize people further to participate in, or to governance token holders to participate in the ecosystem. So if there are things that you are currently rewarding people for, or that you want to reward people for, right, you can reward them the protocol revenue if they're doing those things, but also holding governance tokens, right? And that way, you basically incentivize governance token holders to participate in the ecosystem.
Thank you for the talk, Jay from EtherID. So I'm curious if there's a bright line for in-game currency or platform currency. So REPL has something called REPL credits that allow people to run.
So what I would say is that like this question comes up a lot in the context of in-game currencies, right? And I think that fundamentally what matters is kind of what the economic model is behind that token. So and people within the video game space have been a little bit creative around this stuff, but like at the end of the day, right, is the digital asset uncapped in its total supply amount? Is it not meant to appreciate in value, right? Or is it meant to appreciate in value the more that people are using it and the more that the ecosystem develops? Because if it has a chance, if there's any possibility of it appreciating in value, then people are going to acquire it with an expectation that it's going to appreciate in value. So they're doing so to expect a profit. And as a result of that, like, there's more regulatory risk associated with any token that can basically appreciate in value. Can take that as opposed to a stable coin, right? No one's acquiring $1 million worth of USDC to profit from, right?
Thanks so much for the presentation. Wanted to ask, given that there's clearly a bunch of uncertainty around a lot of elements of tokens and launching them and even operating in this space, do you have any predictions or thoughts on how this kind of plays out in the next few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the really frustrating things in my mind, right, is that like, and what I hope doesn't happen is that like there's not really a good understanding at the policymaker and regulator level around decentralization and why that really like is something that we should be incentivizing, right? And so I think that the thing I'm worried about is that if we end up in an environment, well, first of all, if Gensler has his way currently, right, then like the industry is not going to exist because tokens fundamentally can't be securities, right? So we need to have a pathway that basically provides for tokens to be permissibly like traded and all this stuff that kind of recognizes the value of decentralization and incentivizes people to move towards decentralization. As I was saying earlier, right, one of the fundamental problems in the industry right now is that bad actors are incentivized to take shortcuts and launch tokens, right? And so what we need, and that's because, for the SEC, to be fair to them, it's very hard to determine whether or not someone is decentralized or not, right? You're talking about hours and hours and hours of resources to kind of make that determination. And so as a result of that, right, like the current framework that we have doesn't really work. And we need one that basically gives more objective criteria to what decentralization is, incentivizes builders to move towards decentralization by giving them, by having a less stringent regulatory regime that applies to decentralized assets, as opposed to, centralized ones where there's more risks. And so, like, I hope that that's the direction that we're headed in. You guys will hear, I think, next week or the week after from our regulatory and policy people, and that's like the direction that we're really pushing for. And so hopefully that's where we end up. But like, I would say that no jurisdiction in the world right now has really gotten it right where like, you're tailoring the legal regime to kind of address the risks that actually exist rather than just kind of taking it as an analog for equity.
Thanks so much.
This question kind of extends the earlier question about in-game tokens. So
Yeah.
At Blockus, we work with a lot of game studios, and they all have interest in, at some point, launching a token. So earlier you were talking about not promoting that on secondary markets. How do you think of the difference between like primary markets, secondary markets, and something like decentralized exchanges like Uniswap? Like, does that count as a primary market?
So I guess what I would say is that, like, I think, first off, primary issuances, if you're issuing them for money, right, I think that you're going to be significantly at risk, because if it looks like people are investing in the asset, right, but when they're buying the token. So like the difference between an in-game currency that can appreciate and you're buying it literally digital gold so that you can go buy an asset in-game, right, I think that looks different from, a token that you think is going to actually increase in value over time. And so any kind of primary issuance of that for money, I think is very risky. The secondary markets, I don't really think that there's much of a difference between a Uniswap or a Coinbase, except the difference is, right, is that like, if your asset's going to be listed on Coinbase, typically the way that comes into fruition, right, is that the founders or the team liaise with Coinbase, particularly if you're like a layer 1 or a layer 2, right, they need to bridge into your network in order to actually be able to hold assets. And so as a result of that, there's like, involvement of the management team. And so generally speaking there, right, like it's harder to avoid the idea that this is just something that materialized on its own. Whereas if you issue an ERC-20, right, other than making it non-transferable, you can't stop someone from going and listing it on a secondary exchange. And so as a result of that, you don't have like a fundamental legal obligation to restrict people from being able to put it on those exchanges. And so as a result of that, like, there's less regulatory risk associated with those tokens trading in on-chain venues. But like, I do expect the SEC is going to, put decentralized exchanges under more scrutiny over time, because generally the exchanges are kind of where the choke points for the industry are in terms of people's access. All right.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Miles.